We're Jared and Amanda with After Homeschool, where we help homeschoolers learn about career fields in STEM and beyond. Hello, and thank you for joining us today for our first official full podcast. If this is the second time you're hearing us, it means you saw our pilot episode, just kind of explaining the motivation for what we're doing. So for our first official episode here, we kind of wanted to make sure we're all on kind of the same playing field as far as knowledge of kind of different education levels that are out there. When I had talked to maybe like freshman high school age student I know, he didn't really know what graduate or undergraduate education was, or really the difference between a bachelor's, a master's, associate's, or PhD. So, once you know this and, you've gone through it, it's, you kind of assume everyone else knows it, but that's really not a fair assumption especially for this kind of talk. So we thought we'd just take the time to explain this now, and y'all are welcome to submit any questions you want if there's anything that you didn't know what we were talking about that we took for granted. So don't feel bad if you don't know what this is, or if you don't know what it is that we're talking about already. Again, feel free to send us some questions. So first, all these different STEM fields out there that we've talked about, STEM being science, technology, engineering, and math, they require different degrees. And so historically, you could have someone who might refer to themselves as an engineer, refer to someone who's an engineer who would just kind of be an engineer by trade and with no formal education. But that was really a long time ago. In the recent, at least decade or so, I would think, really you have to have a degree in engineering to really be referred to as an engineer. So and everything we talk to is really going to be with this kind of modern context. So if you want to be, anyone within this STEM field, there's this kind of levels of degrees that you can work your way up to. And so kind of the lowest barrier would be like a technologist. And something like that, the minimum education you would need is an associate's degree. And so really from bottom to top, it goes associates, bachelor's, master's, and PhD. So associates is an associates of science, abbreviated AS. A bachelor's is bachelor's of science, abbreviated BS. For other non-STEM degrees, there's bachelor's of arts, which is a BA. Master's within STEM would be a master's of science. And then the ultimate is a doctorate, which is a PhD. And why the heck would you call a doctorate a PhD? That doesn't make any sense. Well, the reason is it's a doctor of philosophy. And so why the heck would you have a doctor of philosophy for engineering? It's not philosophical really. So I don't have a really great answer to that. I do know that certain universities like MIT, they had a doctor of science, which if I remember right, they were exactly the same as what they would have as a doctor of philosophy, but it was an option for people who didn't want to be a PhD or doctor of philosophy. They were a doctor of science. So at any rate, really, even though it's a doctor of philosophy, it is really a still technical degree when you're doing it in one of these STEM fields. And so that's like the ultimate. And so kind of working our way up, an associate's usually above high school takes about 2 years to get. A bachelor's above high school would be about 4 years to get. Typically, more often than not, it's 5 years. It was for our case, at least. And then on top of a bachelor's, you have to have a bachelor's. If you want to get a master's degree, it's typically another 2 years. And there's different ways you can get a master's, either a course-based or thesis-based. We won't really go into that now. And then above a master's, it's at least 3 more years to get a PhD. And we'll talk maybe a little bit more about what all these different things are. Why is there more than one? What's the graduate versus undergraduate? So for an associate's, that's really typically just a course-based thing. And so if you wanted to get like into welding or, what are some other things you can think of?
Medical technology. A lot of the nursing programs require a 2-year degree. I don't think they call it they have a different grading system where you have an LVN or a registered nurse and I think the LVN is usually about 2 years. It's extremely hands-on, so you can work at the hospital setting.
Yeah, so there is probably a hands-on component to a lot of it. Mm-hmm. But typically it's just like a 2-year degree, and that would be like the technology, the T in the STEM, science, technology. So a lot of those jobs would be just a T or technology, and they'd be an associate's. Although I'm sure there's a lot out there that do have a bachelor's that would still be considered technology part of STEM, wouldn't you say? Mm-hmm. So after associates, the next level up is bachelor's. And so really to work as an engineer or a scientist or a physicist, any of these types of things, you need at least a bachelor's. And so a bachelor's is 4 years of education, typically 5. And that is typically more coursework related, right? where you have a certain number of hours, like 120 credit hours, where each course is 3 or 4 hours, counts for 3 or 4 hours. And in a given semester, for a full-time, it's a minimum of 12 hours or 4 classes to have a full-time semester. And then if you want to finish quicker or have a fuller load or do a minor, you can do more than that. Typically, I did like 12 to 15, usually closer to 15. And inside of these, outside of just the courses to get a bachelor's, typically it's just course-based. There's probably some out there that have a research component, but I think probably most all of them would be just course-based, right?
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen I've seen for a STEM, I guess, like in the medical field, they have a lot of what they call clinicals, and so you have to have a minimum amount of hours to be able to fulfill it. So it's kind of similar, but it has a hands-on component to it.
Yeah. And so at the bachelor's level, it's, most of the time it's just course-based, and it really depends on the degree and the field you're going into, what the courses look like. All degrees out there will have core, what do you call them? Not prerequisites, basics.
Yeah.
To refer to getting your basics out of the way. And so those are kind of bare bones. They just, to make you a more well-rounded person, the university or college will require that you take these basics just to make sure that you're a generally well-rounded human being. And so these would be like composition 1 and 2.
That's equivalent to English.
Yeah, equivalent to English. There would be a history, like the school we went to had a U.S. history, a Texas history. There was government, a Texas government, a U.S. government. These are classes.
Speech.
Maybe.
There's usually a minimum amount of math.
Yeah.
Although it differs outside of STEM how much math it is.
Right. And so those are kind of the basics that most everyone has to get out of the way. And as you say, just getting my basics out of the way, because everyone has to get that. And so if they don't know what they want to do, they could start by taking basics. And so if you want to go if you're watching us on YouTube, this is not a bomb strapped to Amanda's chest. This is our infant. So, and it's making a little bit of noise. So at any rate, yeah, so a lot of people who don't know, who have the problem we're trying to solve, where they don't know why they're going to college, they'll start by just taking these basics classes that they're going to have to finish no matter what degree they go with. So at any rate, so after you get the basics out of the way, you start taking some of the core classes. So if you're in engineering or any of the STEM fields, really, you're going to have higher level math, which is typically going to consist of calculus 1, 2, and 3 different classes. And for a lot of them, it's going to be differential equations on top of that, maybe a statistics or linear algebra class, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then it gets more specific depending on the degree. And so I did mechanical engineering, and so there's all the mechanical engineering classes, the core classes that if you're really into the engineering side, or, if you're really into your degree, which hopefully you are, then you really get excited about finally getting to these after you've gotten through all the basics and the prerequisite math classes and everything. And so for mechanical, that's like your solid mechanics of materials, statics, dynamics, machine design, fluid mechanics, all these mechatronics, all this stuff that sounds really cool. And what for you would that be, those core classes?
It just gets into different types of materials. So you have ceramics, metals, and different various polymers classes, plastics classes.
Mm-hmm.
And then just different classes that talk about, so sorry, he's trying to settle in. He is, so there's different focuses too when you get your bachelor's. So depending on, at least in material science, so you could focus on, materials engineering is essentially about the properties of, and there's more to it, but metal, ceramics, and plastics. And so you could actually focus and take a heavier, polymers related bachelor's.
If you're more interested in polymers or ceramics, you could really focus in on that.
Oh, we haven't even, something you should talk about is a minor.
Yeah. So before I get to that, one note is there's certain classes. I know that University of Oklahoma, or one of the Oklahoma universities, a lot of them really, you can get all the basics, go through the basics, and then you're not technically part of the engineering school until I think you have a certain GPA or something with all these, and then you get admitted into the engineering program. So whereas for our experience, it was really just, I'm a whatever engineering major and here I go. I think as a way to make sure you're really qualified to do the engineering or science fields, you have to do well enough in the certain half of your degree before you really get accepted into the engineering or science side of things. And so, like Amanda said, there's a minor. And so say you really want to do mechanical engineering, and I'm going to say mechanical a lot because that's what I did, but I also have an interest in electrical engineering, or I want to do something in my career that really combines those two things, like robotics. Maybe I want to do a minor in electrical. And so that would put me well suited to do a job where I'm really mostly doing mechanical engineering, but there's a heavy electrical engineering component too that I want to be familiar with and know how to handle that side and really understand what's going on. So that's a minor. And so it depends on from school to school, but typically it's a certain number of credit hours in another discipline that you have to satisfy.
I think it's around 12 to 16 hours.
Yeah, something like that.
And you can get a minor.
Right. And it really depends from school to school. And so as you get closer to moving to college, to the college phase, you really should be picking out schools you're interested in and look into their catalog and look at the requirements for the degree, what's available. And then, so say I gung-ho want to be a roboticist, when I, work in robotics when I graduate. Typically people would pick a university by what's close to home, but if you're really dead set on that, then it would make sense to look at universities that are really known for robotics. And you can look into that by looking at the web pages associated with the department that you're going to work in. Look at the professors. The professors typically have a web page, believe it or not, which showcases their research. And so you can really dig into it as deep as you want to go, and that would really help you narrow in on this is a school I want to do because I know I want to do this. That would be a really good idea. You and I had nowhere near that amount of forethought going into it. We just kind of stumbled our way through everything. But if you did everything perfect, that's really what you should do. Have an idea what you wanted to do and make sure the university that you're going to has a really good reputation for being good at that. Like we went to New Mexico Tech, and the physics department there, they were world renowned for their lightning research. And so if you're really interested in weather and you like physics, that's a really good place to go if you're interested in lightning research. So just something to keep in mind. So after the bachelor's level, okay, finally you finished your 4 or 5 years of school. Now what? You could go get a job for a lot of degrees, especially for engineering. But certain other degrees, if you really want to specialize further, or if it's a field where you really need higher education, the next logical step is a master's degree. And so a master's, do you want to talk about really what a master's is?
So a master's is generally about 30 credit hours. It depends on the program again. Again, it might be thesis based. So a thesis just means it's kind of like you're writing your own book. You have to collect research and write this huge paper. And you have a committee that they actually kind of have to vote on whether you get to pass go and graduate. And they can actually keep you there as long as they feel like they need to. So just be aware of that.
Right. So the master's I got, if I had gone into it planning on doing a master's, I would have done a thesis base. But the way I ended up finishing out, it just made more sense to do a course base. So typically it's a thesis based, and so you have a certain number of hours, and then, like she said, this thesis that you write. And it's a research topic that's really based on what your advisor, you have an academic advisor, based on a lot of what your advisor's research is and what your interests are, and you kind of combine those two and come up with a topic to really research and read a bunch of technical articles that are out there in journals that the school subscribes to. Read those and do some, depending on what you're doing, do experiments, collect data, and put together a report. Or a thesis, and then, like she said, that has to get approved by your committee and get signed off on and by everyone. And so that's master's is typically only for people who really want to specialize in a certain field. So if you really are into robotics, or if you're really into ceramics, that's another way to really get yourself into jobs that are really specialized in those areas.
So this is a little side note, and I would my professor actually told me this when I was in college. So a lot of people have interest in several areas, and they're really tempted to double major. So let's just talk. So a double major means that you get, it's generally a bachelor's degree. I think you can double major as a master's, but that's kind of a different hierarchy. So a double major is typically like when you get 2 masters. So say you really like physics and you really like mechanical engineering, and you go and you get a bachelor's in both. What I typically recommend students do is get a bachelor's in one and a master's in the other. And the big reason is because you get paid more. Because it doesn't matter if you have 50 bachelor's degree, you're going to get paid at the bachelor's level. But if you have a master's, then you get paid at a master's level, and so you get a return on your education. So
And it's
just
probably less time to finish a bachelor's and a master's than two bachelors
yeah,
anyways, I would think. So
a lot of schools have what's called a fast track, where you have to just stay like an additional year, maybe a year and a half, and
Mhm.
you graduate with your master's.
Yeah, New Mexico Tech was like that in mechanical engineering. If they had an explosives, that was the big thing that everybody was into there. If you know Mythbusters, they did a lot of their explosions at New Mexico Tech, the lab they have associated with it. But they had a program where if you wanted to get a master's, particularly in explosives, it was just another year. They call it a 5-year master's. And you just kind of start working on your master's while you're still working on your bachelor's and get it done more quicker. So, so now we've kind of introduced associates, bachelors, and masters. So these 3 degree types, right? So one thing I should mention, backing up a little bit, is an associate's is not only for people who are going to work in these more technical fields. And so you'll talk about a community college, but if you wanted to do like we did and start off at a community college, you can get an associate's in a degree that is a 4-year degree. So they have the community college we went to, and a ton of community colleges out there. They have an associate's in physics. They have an associate, I think, right?
Yes.
They have an associate's in engineering, I know.
Mm-hmm.
And really, no one can do a whole lot with an associate's in engineering. Really, it's just for people who are going to leave this community college and go to a regular 4-year university, and they actually have a degree going in, and that has certain benefits.
You might get a job with an associate's in engineering, but you couldn't work as an engineer.
Right. So you couldn't work as an engineer with an associate's in engineering, but it is a good first step towards a regular bachelor's in engineering if you wanted to start at a community college. So now might be a good time to kind of talk about the difference between a community college and a university.
Okay.
If he'll let you talk.
Yeah, you can settle. All right, buddy. I know. Sorry. Slight technical issue here. Come on, buddy. Okay. All right, so I have a little window. So community college versus a university. Community college is generally a 2-year school, although a lot of students take 3 years to actually get through it because you have to have a lot of, like for instance, with engineering, you don't start getting credit towards your degree until you're in calculus. But depending on the math that you took coming out of high school or homeschool or whatever education you had prior, you might not be ready for calculus. And so you might have to take college algebra and trig before you're able to take calculus. And so that'll give you, obviously you'll have to spend more time at the community college to finish. So community college, typically the professors don't do research, although at some very select community colleges they do. It's not very common. So universities, that's where the instructors actually do research. And so I can get to a little bit of the nitty gritty. So I taught at a community college. So my work schedule, just so you know a little bit about it, I taught 15 credit hours. So that's what I did. If I worked at a university, I think they typically teach between 6 and 9 credit hours. I think it's closer to 6. And then they do research outside of that. And so they have a huge workload. And then, of course, research is never done. So at least with mine, whenever I was done with grading, I was done with work. And so it just gives a little bit. University, that's where you get your bachelor's, your master's, and your doctorate. You typically don't get an associate's at a university.
Yeah, that's typically for...
At a community college, you typically can only either get a certificate for like a trade or you can get an associate's.
Yeah. So, kind of like she said, associates is for these more technical degrees. So like Emerald College is where we went, they have these technical programs with non-destructive testing, welding, all those types of things, medical technology. And then you can do the first half of a bachelor's. And so if your goal in life is, I want to go get a bachelor's in engineering, mechanical engineering, whatever, that doesn't mean you should just jump right into a university. There's some cases where it would make sense to do that, but those are kind of unique. So really the more economical thing to do is if you want to go for a bachelor's in some engineering or whatever, it really makes more sense to start at a community college. And the reason is they're so much cheaper. Back when we went, it was like $800 a semester or something, and compared to thousands a semester. I think it was 2,000 a semester at New Mexico Tech where we went. And so there's a lot of savings involved. And so even if you're dead set on doing a 4-year degree at a university, it still has a lot of economical sense to start at a community college. I know I had a really concern, well, what if the quality of education really wasn't good? Am I going to have trouble when I transfer? And that might be a legitimate concern for some places, but it really wasn't for us. And honestly, being homeschooled, you learn to teach yourself already, and so chances are you're going to do really well anyways. I know I did, and pretty much every homeschool student I know did really well. And so even if the quality of instruction wasn't good, you're going to be reading the textbook anyways. And so if you learn everything that's in the textbook, you'll be doing great. So don't worry about it. The one exception I can think of to that is especially in Texas, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but at least at the time when we went, if you graduated within the top 10% of your class in high school, in a public high school, so homeschoolers are kind of left out in the cold on this one, but if you went to a public high school and you graduated, and I think it was the top 10%, then you were guaranteed admission into any university in Texas. And so, certain universities do have a heck of a lot better reputation than others. So like, University of Texas and Texas A&M and Rice are like the best universities in Texas, I think. So that's a really good way to get into a really great university, because if you go through the community college route, then really your performance, your credentials, your resume, everything is all that has to be gone through, and you have to get into admission that way. And so it's more competitive. You don't have a guaranteed slot into these really good universities. And so that's something to keep in mind. I know our audience here is probably all homeschooled, and so it's really not applicable to us. It wasn't applicable to me. But if you are going to high school, keep that in mind, at least in Texas, and check the laws and everything now. It might have changed in the last 10 years, but that's how it was back then. That if you went public school route, you did well. You were guaranteed into these really good universities, but that perk gets lost if you do the first half at a community college. So at any rate, that's kind of a big side note. So we had gotten to the point of talking about associates, bachelors, and masters. So one thing I wanted to point out is that there's this terminology that you'll start to hear of undergraduate versus graduate school, undergraduate degree versus graduate degree. And so it's really not complicated at all. An undergraduate degree is like a bachelor's.
Or an associate's.
Or an associate's. And a graduate degree or graduate school is above that. So master's degree or master's, going for your master's, or PhD or doctorate. So that's another terminology thing that might be weird to people who aren't used to hearing it. So one other tangent I wanted to mention, since it came up, was we were talking about research. And so I know when I started out, I didn't know what the heck that meant. Research. What are you talking about? Research. Professors doing research. So just real quick, how do things get invented in the world, right? It happens a lot of different ways. There's inventors out there who invent things, and then they hold the intellectual property rights, and they sell the intellectual property rights. I think that's probably a low percentage. Most of the research that gets done, especially like really fundamental research that doesn't have a lot of financial backing or financial reasoning behind it, that occurs at universities and national labs. And this is where like taxpayer money goes through fellowships with like the National Science Foundation, or grants that professors apply for. And so when we're talking about doing research, these are professors at a university. These are professors who get money through grants, and these grants could come from a lot of different places, but they get money to do research. And so this research can be in tons of different areas. It could be in something really specific that the grant people given the grant are really interested in learning about. Fluid flow, or fluid dynamics, or whatever, say fluid dynamics around an airfoil of a certain design for the Army or something like this. Or it could be something really basic and like cancer research or something, or even really, really fundamental stuff, just really extending human knowledge. And that kind of work is typically done at universities and national labs. And national labs is these big, government-funded facilities where they do research, and they publish all their work, and it goes into academic journals that people can read. And along with university professors do the same thing. They publish all their work in these academic journals, and it kind of builds on itself, like I think it's Newton that says, if I can see further, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants, basically saying that I did as so well as I I did. I could see so well into, the work I was doing because I had the work of others to kind of stand on top of. And so that's kind of the spirit of this whole thing, that you do research, you record it, you publish it, it gets peer reviewed, meaning people review it and verify it's accurate. And then that's a starting point for someone to do more research, and they reference your papers, et cetera. So that's a big topic. So that didn't make a lot of sense, don't worry. But I thought that was kind of worth mentioning what we mean by research. So kind of the final leg, we talked about associates, bachelors, masters, going from undergraduate up to bachelors to graduate, from masters and beyond. So finally we get to above a master's. Why in the heck would you want to go for more school, right? So you've gone 4 or 5 years for a bachelor's, you've gone 2 years for a master's, so now you're like 6 or 7 years in. Why the heck would you want to do more school? And so if you want to do more school, that's the PhD level. And so there are certain jobs. Do you want to kind of go off on why you would do a PhD, and in the cases where that would be applicable?
So there's good and bad to getting a PhD. It's good if you want to go into like the research realm. And by research, you can work at a private lab or a government-funded lab, or you can also stay in academia. Academia just means that in school. You stay in school forever.
Or work at a company that does a lot of research. That research is done at companies too, but it's more based on what the company does. Anyways.
I think with manufacturing too, they used to do a lot more research at the companies, but now it's starting to kind of go away, and we'll talk about that in another, like larger companies are starting to acquire smaller companies versus doing actual research. But that'll be another topic. So it's great if you want to go into those areas. The bad thing is say you get your PhD and you figure out that none of those areas are for you, like you don't want to do research, or sometimes you can overqualify yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really hard to find a job. So overqualifying means that a company does not want to hire you because they have to pay you the market value.
Yeah.
And if they don't want to pay you, they won't hire you.
Right. Yeah, the market value of someone with a PhD is more than someone with a master's, and so your knowledge is a heck of a lot more narrow too. And so, so really the main reasons in my knowledge to do a PhD is really you want to do research, and so you want to work at a national lab, you want to be a professor and do research, or you want to work at a company that is really research heavy and you want to do research there. And, that's really cool. I was really into research too. And there's a lot of people who are, a lot of people who aren't, but.
So there's one thing I want to add to that. Jared's, I didn't mean to break his train of thought, but so at universities, typically you can't move up in the ranks unless you have a PhD.
Yeah. So it's a requirement for a lot of things too.
So like the president of a college typically has a PhD.
Yeah. So even the community college. So even though most instructors at community college don't have a PhD, the higher level people in the administration typically do, and they're usually a lot of times doctorate in education or something like that. So at any rate, so if you really into research, then a PhD makes sense. But you really need to know what research you're really into. It really helps. You don't have to. And then there's certain fields like physics, for example. If you're really into physics, there's not a whole lot of jobs out there for you. Really, they are teaching physics or research. And so if you're going to teach physics, then you could get away with a bachelor's or master's, and maybe, I don't know what the minimum requirement is, but like teach at a high school. But beyond that, unless you want to not work in physics, if you want to do research in physics, then you really need a PhD. And so it's kind of like you can either do the minimum and be a high school teacher, or if you want to do real research in physics, you have to have a PhD. So it's kind of a bimodal thing of what you have to do, either this one or this one. And so you really have to know what you want to go for. I think that's kind of the same thing with psychology too, if I'm not mistaken. But
psychology, biology, there's a lot of degrees, and this is not cut and dry. Because you might find some company that really values a bachelor's in physics, and they'll allow you to kind of work in that realm, at least a small percentage of it. But, by far, most of the physicists that we've known have just continued to get a PhD.
And there are exceptions, so you're not completely stuck. I worked in the gearing industry for a long time, not a long time, but for a while, and I was involved in committees, and one of the best people on all these committees, she has a master's in physics. I don't think she even has an engineering degree. So I'm not sure how she got where she is, but she's definitely an exception. But you can do it, so you're not completely stuck if you get a master's or get a degree in physics and end up wanting to do something else. So Elon Musk had a bachelor's in economics and physics, so you can do that too. So at any rate, so that's kind of the main reasons you would want to do a PhD if you really are interested in the research, or if you're really wanting to go for a career that requires a PhD. Just keep in mind that if you're going for a PhD, so there's this little graphic that I've seen talking about kind of the knowledge that you get, a bachelor's, a master's, and a PhD. So if you imagine a circle being your knowledge base that you gain in a degree, okay, a bachelor's is like a fairly small circle. A master's, say not small, so medium-sized circle. A master's is maybe 20%, 30% larger than that, okay? But more heavily leaned in one direction. So you're not getting a generally larger knowledge in mechanical engineering if you have a master's in mechanical engineering. You do research, you do a thesis, you're really leaning towards a specific subject area with a master's. And then a PhD is like you're taking a needle and poking through the edge of this circle, the master's level circle. And really, you're really just taking one really minute sliver part of this whole field of mechanical engineering, and you're trying to push the boundary of knowledge. And so really with a PhD, you're not just studying knowledge that was out there already. You're really required in most cases to create new knowledge. And so that's really one of the fundamental requirements for a lot of PhDs, if not all of them. I'm not familiar with all of them, but is that you're not just like a master's where you just read other people's research, summarize it for a thesis. For a PhD, you have a dissertation, and you have to really create new knowledge. And so you're really pushing the boundaries of knowledge, which, is really cool to a lot of people. You're really making new knowledge that goes out there, and that's a requirement to graduate. And so bachelor's, you have a base set of knowledge. Master's, more knowledge, but more focused in this general area. PhD, you're really breaking new knowledge in a really specific area. And so you're really, like Amanda was getting to, you're really pigeonholing yourself, not into being kind of overqualified, but you're really an expert in a really small sliver of an area. And so hopefully the career you're after, was involved in that small sliver of an area. But if it's not, probably a lot, if not most, people who get PhDs, they end up doing research in a different area, but it really helps. Like, the research group I was in at Johns Hopkins, some of the most famous people who came out of the lab group I was working in, they kind of extended the research they had done in my lab group and went to work for the Air Force Research Lab in Ohio, continuing on the research they did in the lab group at Johns Hopkins, or under that same professor. So I hope that makes sense. It's a lot for half an hour to kind of understand what it took us several years to figure out. But kind of, especially at high school, that's all really foreign to you, but really just kind of understand that the fundamentals of what we talked about, the associates, most of the time that's for the technologist type people, or for people who want to go to a community college, get the first half of a bachelor's done. Bachelor's is for most of the degrees within STEM. Master's focuses you more in an area that you're interested in and would demand a higher salary. And PhD is really for people who are really into research and want to extend the boundary of knowledge. And there's nothing wrong with taking a break between degrees, especially if it's between bachelor's and master's or master's and PhD. A lot of people get a bachelor's, work 5 years, and realize that I wish I was in some other industry, and then they can go and get a master's with a focus in something and then go work on that something, and that really helps them get into another industry, and same with the PhD.
Well, we'll have a show at some point about funding, but a lot of times the company that you're working for will pay for your master's.
That's a good point.
So a lot of people choose to go out and work for a while.
Yep, that's definitely true. So I think that kind of covers the scope that we had in mind for this talk. Is there anything else you can think of?
I think that's it. I think you guys have plenty to work with.
Yep. All right. Well, we appreciate you guys hanging out with us today. Tune back in, or check back another half week or so.
Thank you for joining us today.
We'll
This
talk to you next
podcast
time.
is sponsored by Blue Barrel Scientific, a curriculum company that helps homeschoolers discover their career field, one experiment at a time.